Every humane community at least has a grasp on the idea of guidelines that tells the do's and don'ts of acts and behaviors. This is what separates humans from animals, making order instead of living in a chaotic, anarchical world. The United States and Mexico share a border, yet completely different justice systems. The moment that one crosses through the border, there's distinct warnings of each side, informing not to break the law for various things. This is because of the different judiciary procedures. Inherently, there are claims of existing flaws in both systems, but they manage to hold strengths that separates them and that allows them to shine amidst other legal systems. With this known, we had ourselves a question. How effective is Mexico's criminal justice system? Through extensive research and interviews, the answer isn't surprising but could catalyze reformation. Given the before points, it is a pleasure to contrast these court systems, bring a spotlight to the injustices that ought to be mended, and start righting them. Act 1. The Basics. A comparison of systems. The American and Mexican legal systems have fundamental divergences on the structural level that make it impossible for them to be compared without speaking to what judicial systems are based on. Civil versus common law. For starters, America is based on a common law system, whereas Mexico has a civil law system. Let's dig in on the civil law system. In this one, judges are investigators that take charge by bringing charges, establishing facts through witnesses, and establishing an intended solution that would make a restoration to address a wrong. Whereas in common law, judges taking such an active role would be unheard of and very biased. In common law, it relies on punitive punishments that would address the wrong. Following this in a matter of roles, in common law, the lawyers make the presentations, establish the facts, and attempt to convince a neutral judge of guilt or innocence. For common law, each legal case creates a doctrine and the concept stare decisis, Latin for let the decision stand. This is then cited as precedent for cases that are the same, which creates a legacy of cases that can be called upon. If deciding a case with no precedent, jurisprudence is used to interpret the Constitution, federal law, then state law, in that order, to render a decision. As opposed to civil law, precedent isn't heavily emphasized, and the law applied is from written codes as opposed to a citation from a prior legal decision. Furthermore, to practice law in common law, one must be a certified lawyer with over 7 years of upper education experience. Federal circuits. The American court system was built from the third article of the Constitution, which stipulates that there is a Supreme Court with federal circuit courts rather than a ring of lower courts. Each court is manned by an established, educated judge and a team of staff. There is a lot of money that goes into the courts, which prevent bribery and corruption. There is also a strict code that regulates both lawyers and judges and how they ought to conduct themselves during proceedings, ensuring that the due process is given in a uniform manner. And should there be an error in the procedure, which typically results in injustice, there's a federal court of appeals to look over what happened. This system is tight, but due to the merits of common law, there can be large disagreements if a precedent perceived as unjust is reinforced, or if a precedent perceived as just is overturned. The whims of the decisions are left to the judges, which puts heavy emphasis on a strong education, exemplary critical thinking skills, and an agenda for justice. Mexico's federal courts are considered to be some of the best organized and most efficient, with the Supreme Court having a reputation of professional integrity and efforts to bring fairness. The higher echelons of the Mexican court handle a lot of amparo work, which is essentially a Latin American form of a judicial review, a form of appeal you use when you think a sentence or a law goes against your basic human rights. While American federal courts are regulated by the Constitution and doctrinalism, the Mexican courts are regulated by the Mexican Constitution and the codes that govern the judicial power in the country, from the civil code structure. The Cedillo's reformations. The events. Mexico's previous president, Ernesto Zedillo, on December 5th of 1994, proposed a reform to the National Justico Upper Court. This maneuver was discussed as a measure to pave the way to the almost defunct, in means of making the upper court in the fair game grounds. This was practically having a term limit to each of the ministers and reducing the number of them, dissolving the 26 of them, later to only 11, just as the original 1917 Mexican Constitution planned, taking the better, faster, and stronger approach. Cedillo's reforms have reinvigorated the Mexican Supreme Court and have encouraged them to strike down unconstitutional laws through their judicial review. He gave a speech aimed at the crowd of Mexican politicians, arguing that the country required changes in the political, judicial, and economic processes to be more functional and flexible in terms of nowadays needs. The causes and effects. There are many causes for this, some of them backing that the new neoliberal economic plans needed legal shielding. Some other causes say that the Mexican power division, executive, legislative, and judicial weren't on par. This is based on the 1996 political reform that followed the 1994 one, which included more ways for a fair game in the electoral and the appointments and lower court figures. The effects of this have gone a long way. Out of the 26 ministers removed, 2 of them made it back to the upper courts and worked along the term and the following one. Their stay was meaningful for the integration of the old court justice system and the development of the new court justice system. There was also the management of more viable ways to work as a federal judge, having more independence from outer forces such as political parties, and the creation of an inner council that took upon the request of having more administrative power and easier collaboration between legislative to judicial powers. The creation of inner institutions made on his reform paved the way until 2016. More reforms made sure that any citizen or NGOs allow having a side or lower and upper court proceedings, fading the opaque old court justice system. The whys on the prominent issues of the Mexican judiciaries: corruption and links to being a pawn to the Acton regime. The first long-standing problem in the Mexican judiciary at all levels was the lack of overseeing inner institutions that could monitor possible cases of corruption and the missing control mechanisms that could stop the abuse of power. This didn't mean that there weren't any implementations on any levels of courts, but the old court justice system for these types of cases wasn't as helpful as the new one. This, backed by the lack of pre-existing laws that could help to link and charge more easier authorities or judges who had been bribed or colluded with unlawful activity by organized crime or corrupt politicians. One other thing to note is the lack of a courtroom creates the ex parte problem. While ex parte is strictly banned in America, it's not expressly prohibited by Mexican law. This means that in the judges' chambers, or even over lunch, some shady business could occur, and in this case, all parties can do is hope that the judge remains impartial. Indigenous justice. At the brink of 1994, there was an uprising of Mexican Indigenous Revolutionary Forces, EZLN, in the south of Mexico. The background of this was the highly unfair treat to the indigenous people over a great span of time. They claimed that there were no efforts from the state or federal powers to help the situation, and they were forgotten. There wasn't an existing institution that was capable to provide services and neither any law efforts at the time to keep a sane figure of state of law against the crimes of the Mexican army and the paramilitary committed to numerous ethnic tribes. Decentralized power. It is also tied up with the handle that the state has concerning their code of law. This belongs to the difficulty that presents itself when decentralized power faces when reforming the whole justice system and their proceedings are different with each state. Poverty and high costs of having a trial. Poverty takes a role on the delivery of justice in Mexico, as the cost it takes to hire lawyers are sometimes way too high considering the wages. The people's opinions. The Mexican judiciary's history of being a pawn to executive and congressional power has taken its toll on public opinion. In March of 2020, law students took the streets in playas of Tijuana to ask beachgoers, shop owners, and the general public to talk about the Mexican court. The questions were unbiased, but the responses would always be tuned to the same song of corruption and distrust. In playas, our term of specialists walked down the beach to talk to a middle-aged couple. They lamented, asserting that sometimes they had to pay the police, the armed wing of the judiciary, just to stay under the radar and out of the law. Essentially, corrupt police had forced an illegal fine upon them to make money for themselves, which left a very negative impression of the Mexican justice system. Their sentiments were reinforced by couples and business owners alike around. We walked inside a renowned tattoo parlor. The owner hushed us and escorted us to the back of the room, where he lowered his bandana mask and responded in Spanish that justice is a rich concept, coming to those who have money. While he didn't explicitly say he was talking about the lower courts, one could assume that blatant bribery and corruption are most likely to occur in the lower courts due to corruption and judicial decisions being more heavily scrutinized the higher up the chain of the command one goes. And in a particularly exciting interview, we were able to talk to Ivan, a law student at the University of Torreón in Mexico. He is currently working at a private firm with a team of 5 lawyers. The most common cases they see concern criminal justice, labor law, commercial law, family, and fiscal matters. He says the main reason the government has initiated new reforms is that the old system was tied up to some sketchy beginnings. Simply put, the principle of legality was kind of uncertain. This meant that many times justice never came. He notes that it's too early to tell how truly effective the new reforms are to the justice system, but it's surely an improvement from the past. What has been done? The 2019 Mexican presidential appointment of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the Supreme Court was empty of 3 seats out of 11. This meant that a new wave of candidates was raised. Remarks as of this happening were more on the side of possibly having more backing of his projects. This was also seen as an understandable look back of the 1994 situation. Having a new relatively framework of law proceedings was enough for the Congress to begin revisions to the Mexican Constitution and analysis of crimes. Obrador presented in late February of 2020 the news of a new version of the 1994 reform, but highlighted that it won't be as deep as the original plan. Also bringing measures to end the low conviction rates and unsolved murder cases, such as the expansion of preventive detention and the broadening of the concepts and limits of evidence. Is there any hope for a more functional judiciary? Overall, this new system is designed to be impartial, public, faster, and cheaper, and if we find a way to make it work how it's supposed to, it can change the perspective of citizens that believe they live in a country where the justice system treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you are poor and innocent. At the end of the day, Mexico has a lot to improve on to make this new system work. Yet, they certainly have an advantage, being that Mexico has adopted the Roman civil code archetype. Through the similarities and differences, there are profound injustices that can be found in the Mexican system that just aren't in there in the American system, but nevertheless remain confident that the judicial reforms and new approach towards an empowered and independent judiciary will try to ensure a more pure form of justice being delivered. An impartial and balanced judicial system is fundamental in every society because it's not only a hallmark of modern civilization, but also reflects a salubrious morality within society. Martin Luther King, the father of modern American civil rights, sums up our position very well. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In other words, it is our duty as faithful and diligent citizens to recognize injustices and to do our best to correct them.